The brewery filed its paperwork within weeks, not to account for the dead, not to explain what had gone wrong inside the St. Giles parish, but to recover the tax on the beer that had killed them. 8 people were gone. The families had nothing, and the Meux and Company Brewery, sitting at the edge of one of London's most desperate neighborhoods, was already doing the arithmetic on its losses, not in lives, but in barrels. This is not really a story about a flood. It is a story about who gets compensated and who does not. The St. Giles Rookery in 1814 was not a neighborhood in any comfortable sense of the word. It was a grid of overcrowded courts and alleys just north of what is now Oxford Street, where Irish immigrants, the destitute and the working poor were packed into tenements, several families to a room. The mortality rate was extraordinary. Gin shops outnumbered churches. The streets ran open with waste. It was the kind of place that London's wealthier residents preferred not to think about, until, on the afternoon of October 17th, they were given a reason they could not ignore. The Meux and Company Brewery stood on Tottenham Court Road. It was one of London's great industrial operations, a monument to the porter trade that had made certain men very wealthy in the late 18th century. At its heart were enormous wooden fermentation vats, some holding over 100,000 gallons of porter. They were impressive, and they were aging. The vats were bound by iron rings, and those rings had been known to slip. In September of 1814, a maintenance worker noted that one of the rings on a large vat had fallen away. The brewery recorded the observation. No one replaced the ring. October 17th, 1814, a Monday afternoon. Around 5 o'clock, the iron hoop on the largest vat gave way entirely. The vat contained an estimated 135,000 gallons of fermenting porter. When it ruptured, the force was sufficient to destroy a second vat beside it, then a third. The back wall of the brewery collapsed outward. A wave estimated at 15 feet high by some contemporary accounts, though the exact height was never officially confirmed, poured into the streets of St. Giles. It moved fast. The alleys were narrow. There was nowhere for it to go, and nowhere for the people inside the houses to run. The flood entered the basements and ground floors of the surrounding tenements almost immediately. Several families lived below street level. A woman named Eleanor Cooper, according to parish records, was killed in her home. A young girl named Hannah Banfield, 4 years old, died. A mother, her infant, and several other residents of New Street and adjacent courts were lost. The final confirmed death toll was 8 people. Some reports at the time suggested more bodies may never have been recovered from the debris. That claim was never fully resolved. 8 is the number that entered the record. Whether it was the true number remains uncertain. The immediate chaos gave way to something quieter and in many ways more disturbing. The flood had destroyed the homes of the people it killed. The families of the dead had no money for funerals. No money for coffins in several cases. So the bodies were laid out inside the damaged tenements, in the rooms where people still lived, because there was no alternative. And then something happened that tells you everything about the economics of poverty in 1814. Word spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors, and then strangers, began arriving at the doors of the bereaved. They paid 1 penny to view the bodies. The families accepted. Contemporary accounts noted that in at least one house, the floor gave way under the weight of the crowd that had gathered to view the dead. Several people were injured. The viewing had drawn so many visitors that the structure, already weakened by the flood, could not hold them. There is something almost impossible to process about that detail. The grief of the very poor had become a minor spectacle, and the spectacle had become briefly dangerous. The penny viewings were not unusual for the era. They were a known practice among London's destitute. That fact makes it no less stark. It makes it, if anything, more so. The inquest into the disaster was held within days. The jury returned a verdict of accidental death. No individual at the brewery was named. No charge was brought. The brewery itself faced no criminal liability, a fact consistent with how industrial accidents were treated in early 19th century England. But what happened next was not simply the absence of accountability. It was something more active. The Meux and Company Brewery submitted a formal petition to the British government. They requested the return of the excise duty paid on the beer that had been destroyed in the flood. The government agreed. The brewery received its rebate. The precise amount of the rebate is not recorded in sources I have been able to confirm. What is documented is that the petition was made and that it succeeded. The brewery recovered financial losses from the state. The families of the 8 dead received no equivalent remedy. No compensation scheme existed for them. No petition was filed on their behalf. The parish of St. Giles offered what poor relief it could, which was very little. The asymmetry is the story. A corporation suffered a property loss and was made whole by the government. 8 of the city's poorest residents died, and the government's role ended at the inquest verdict. The Meux Brewery continued to operate. It was eventually demolished in 1921, and the site became what is now the Dominion Theatre on Tottenham Court Road. There is no plaque for the 8 people who died. The Rookery of St. Giles was largely cleared in the second half of the 19th century as part of urban improvement schemes, improvements that displaced the very communities they claimed to serve. The streets where Eleanor Cooper and Hannah Banfield died no longer exist in any recognizable form. The geography of poverty was erased along with the poverty itself, or rather, the poverty was simply moved somewhere less visible. The London beer flood appears in history as a curiosity. A strange accident with an almost absurd quality, a wave of beer, a broken vat, a city briefly overwhelmed by something that sounds like the premise of a joke. That framing has served a purpose, whether intentionally or not. It keeps the focus on the spectacle and away from the ledger, away from the petition, away from the penny viewings and what they tell us about what it cost to be poor in 1814. The flood lasted minutes. The conditions that made its consequences so devastating for some and so manageable for others, those lasted considerably longer. There is a version of this story where the flood is the story. The broken vat, the wave, the chaos of a Monday afternoon in October. That version is easier. It has a beginning, a middle, and a clear end. The version worth knowing is the one that begins after the water recedes, in the paperwork, in the parish records, in the small ceramic dish on a stool beside the dead. That version does not end cleanly. It simply continues in different forms, in different cities, in different centuries. The next story is just as buried. Stay close.